Chapter 1 Malini. A rider returned from Ahiranya on the day Malini first glimpsed the sea. An army on the move had a particular unpleasant stench of horse flesh and elephant dung, sweating men and the tang of iron under hot sunlight. Malini had hoped over the weeks of travel that she would grow accustomed to it, but she had not. Every time the wind blew and the thin curtains surrounding her chariot billowed back and forth, Malini smelled it all anew. The breeze that carried the ocean with it cut through the smell like a shining knife. It was a sharp scent, bitter with salt. She stood taller in her chariot when she felt it touch her cheek, reached to draw her curtain aside and let the wind reach her unimpeded by cloth. Without the fabric clouding her vision, she could see the army that surrounded her. Warriors from Shumna, with maces hefted over their shoulders. Sakitan liegemen with liege marks emblazoned on their sashes, and whips coiled at their waists. Alorans with chakrams at their wrists, riding alongside Dwawali archers on their white stallions with blood-red saddles, and her own Parijati forces ringed around her, dressed in imperial white and gold, with their sabers bare, the steel gleaming beneath the sun. This was her army, the combined forces of the city-states of the empire. That would help her unseat her brother and seize the throne. Her throne, by right of blood and of prophecy. And over their heads she could see the thinnest trace of blue, the sea. She had known she would see it eventually, before Aditya had rejected his birthright one time too many, before Malini had been named empress. The handful of lords who had stood in staunch support of Aditya had made plans for their forces to meet and follow the path to Dwawali, keeping to a route along the coast wherever possible, land that was under the purview of those less loyal to Chandra. They had intended to make their way to Lal Kila, a fort on the edge of the empire, built to withstand attacks from the nomadic Babrir and the Jagate, who lived beyond the empire's borders, a fort they hoped that was strong enough to keep Chandra at bay too. Malini had seen no reason to alter plans long in the making, plans that she had helped to form, with carefully placed suggestions and cajoling letters in her time as the princess of Parijatvipa under Chandra's thumb. But still there had been something viscerally satisfying about watching her army grow, as foot soldiers and elephant cavalry had joined them along the journey, as new lords had welcomed her arrival to their land, swearing loyalty and opening their villages and havelis to Malini's men, feeding them and arming them, and sending their own heirs and warriors to join the growing procession heading to the distant Lal Kila. Even facing lords who were more reluctant to ally with her had been its own kind of pleasure. To watch them stand proudly against her and then crumble when faced with her army, her allies, the steadiness of her smile? That had done more than any flattery and veneration ever could have to blunt the edge of the constant hunger in her, the writhing, burning, craving that would only be sated by Chandra's death. So many distant plans were finally blooming to life before her eyes, and not in Aditya's service, but in her own. After the hard, endless work that had gone into the making of them, her plans now moved like a force of nature, like waves that swelled and grew, each one feeding into her rise to power. It was exhilarating. As she gazed at the sea, she mused that if she had been a woman of greater faith, she would have considered a glimpse of it a sign that her army was itself a vast and unstoppable sea, that nothing could stand in the way of her fate. But she had more of a pragmatic nature. She took a more practical interpretation of the sight. Instead, when she had gazed at the maps of the empire and charted the route with her eyes and her fingertips, she had known her army would touch the coast when they were mere week from Dwawali's borders. Now they were here, breathing in the greenness of salt, a cool breeze that moved through the army and made a few men pause, raising their sweat-slick faces to capture their coolness on their skin. They would reach Dwawali soon, and the Lal Kila soon after that. The next stop in her rise to the throne had almost begun. Next to her, Lata let out a noise of quiet awe. "Have you seen the scene before?" Malini asked. She could feel Lata craning her head to catch a glimpse of it over Malini's shoulder. Obligingly, Malini leaned back to allow it. "In scripture," said Lata. "Illustration in books, art, but not in person. And you, my lady." You know I have not, Malini replied. She waited a moment longer, then let the curtain fall back into place. There are plenty of rivers and lakes in Parijat, but the Imperial Mahal is as distant from the coast as it's possible to be. A shame, Lata said, that we cannot stop and admire it. The men will need to rest eventually, said Malini. No doubt we'll have our chance then. Perhaps we can even go swimming. She could feel Lata's look at that. I'm sure they will all turn their backs respectfully if I ask them to. You're making a joke, Lata said dubiously. Clearly not a very good one, Malini said. Of course, we'll do no such thing. But she would have liked to. She thought with wistful grief of Alori and Narina. Her heart sisters would have loved the sea. Narina would have walked in the water ankle-deep only, holding her skirt up with both hands. She had always been far too careful of her clothing to do more. Alori would have waded in deep, slipping into the water like a fish. Alor was full of as many rivers as Parijat, and her brothers had all taught her to swim as well as they could. I miss you, she thought, speaking to nothing in the quiet of her heart. I will always miss you. Unbidden, the thought of Priya rose in her mind as it so often did. What would Priya think of the sea? She could not imagine Priya out there. In her mind's eye, all she could see was Priya as she'd been in the forest, waist-deep in water, hair sleek, loose, and soft in Malini's hands, the feel of Priya's mouth against her own. She took the thought carefully away like a treasure. That night, when Malini's tent was erected, there was no time to admire the coastline, and in truth, Malini had not expected there would be. She was relieved, almost, that there was not. It would not have been the same without her heart sisters. Better to leave it as a dream. The most senior and loyal Parijatviva's highborn joined her for the evening meal. Wine was brought out in carafes of beaten metal, and tea for those who did not imbibe, small cups rich in milk and sugar and cardamom. Food was simple, but far more lavish than what was being fed to the rest of the men. Fresh parathas, dal thick with ghee, and rice heaped with onions fried and deep lustrous gold. There were special dishes, occasionally, to please the palace of different highborn. Sharply spiced sabis for the lords of Shungna had been brought out today. These were a particular favorite of Lord Prakesh, who was one of the oldest lords in attendance and made no bones about being set in his ways and his tastes. Malini listened attentively to Lord Mahesh. The man she had named the general of her army informed her of the progression of their journey. She maintained her posture, her calm, and touched barely anything. Not even the wine, though the sip she had brought to her lips left heat in her blood. Lata was seated in the corner of the tent, watching. She was Malini's only female companion. The men all thought her present for the sake of propriety. It was a curiously difficult business to uphold the image of propriety and prophecy and goddess-chosen empress, especially when you were eating. She had seen her own father deepen his cups, staining his clothes, but then her father had been an emperor, and Malini was not. So she ate only sparingly, knowing she would have a proper meal later when the night was cold and deep, and she and Lata could share food intended for the common soldiers. A little pickled mango or onion, practically stoppered in oil for a long journey, and a paratha gone dry, unsoftened by the golden sheen of ghee. A quick gulp of lukewarm tea, spiced so heavy-handedly that it burned almost unpleasantly on the way down. Prince Rao is absent again, I see, said Lord Mahesh. He did not speak loudly enough for the other highborn to hear him. He has his responsibilities, Malini replied. We all do, Mahesh said. One of them, a most vital one, is this, a moment of bonding, of discussion. We must be united, Empress. Moments such as this are what make us whole. Gestured at the men around them, wreathed in soft lantern light. It was amusing to hear Mahesh speak of bonding and unity, when Malini was herself so conscious of how different she was from the men around her. How carefully she had to hold herself apart, and how distant she felt from them. They were of use to her, and she liked them for that, of course, but they were not Alori, or Narina, or Lata. Not Priya. She did not know how to love them, truly love them, and had no desire to. Lord Mahesh, Malini said, You know, as I do, where Prince Rao goes." A shared look, without breaking eye contact, Mahesh refilled his cup of wine. "Do not mistake me, Empress. I am glad he is able to console and comfort Prince Aditya. I would be glad if the prince allowed others to do the same." Mahesh was a powerful figure in Parijat, with many high-born Parijati allies, due to the ancient standing of his family. His ancestors had been there when Divyanshi and the Mothers of Flame that followed her burned. Ever since, they had been a family known for its military prowess and its religiosity, and Mahesh had always been loyal to Aditya, not Chandra, had unwaveringly supported the idea of taking back the throne he had abandoned. His refusal to agree with Chandra's form of faith had won Malini followers she would not otherwise have had. She had chosen him as her general for all those reasons. His presence at her side was an advantage. But his affection for her brother was not exactly an irritant, but a potential problem in the making. For all he had been unfailingly respectful of her, respect did little good if she could not grasp control of his loyalty and bind it to her permanently. "You sought him out again?" Malini asked. "He refused my company, as he refuses everyone's." "Everyone but Rao's," went unsaid, and Malini's, of course. "My brother feels adrift," she said. "He seeks to focus upon his relationship with the Nameless and find a new path for himself. When he finds his way, he will surely welcome the comfort of old friends and allies. Perhaps you can speak to him, Empress." "I do," said Malini, "and I shall." If he refuses to listen, she thought grimly, then that is his own business. A rustle of cloth. A guard drew back the tent flap. Yogesh, one of the military administrators who managed her army supplies, entered and bowed low. He was dressed plainly in a turban and sash-bound tunic, but even if she had not known him by sight, the single chakram on his wrist and the dagger neatly tucked into his turban wrapping would have marked him as an administrator from Alor, and accordingly loyal to Rao, and through Rao, to her. "My sincere apologies for the interruption, Empress, my lords." The light of the oil lanterns flickered over his face as he tilted his head in Malini's direction. "But an urgent messenger has arrived for the Empress." Her heart gave a sudden thump. She had many riders in her service. An Empress needed even more eyes and ears than a princess, and Malini had ensured that she would have spies and messengers across the breadth of the empire. Not a day passed without word from allies arriving or departing, carried by men on horseback. But among all these riders, she had used only one of Rao's loyal men, and that man had been tasked with one particular journey. An urgent message could have been anything, absolutely anything, and yet the presence of Yogesh and no other administrator, and the meaningful look on his face, made hope grasp her insides. "Well then," she said and rose. Mahesh gave her a grave look, half rising himself. She waved a hand. "Enjoy your meal. There is no need to stop for my sake." "Empress," Yogesh said, ducking his head in respect, "the messenger is in Prince Rao's company. I can ask for him to be sent to you immediately." "No need," she replied. "Take me to them." Better to have this conversation with Rao present. She learned that messengers did not respond well to being spoken to directly by a prophecy-blessed empress, and she could not see Rao alone in her tent, even with Letta and guards for company. The tent the military administrators shared was full of books and ledgers carried from site to site, expertly wrapped in scented cloth that kept the paper from rotting in the heat or rain and repelled the various insects they encountered. As she entered, there was a scramble of bowing, papers dropped. She ignored the commotion, seeking out the messenger. She saw Rao first, dressed up in his princely finery, with his brace of daggers and his chakrams, speaking to a broad-shouldered, very nervous-looking Aloran man. When they saw her, Rao bowed. The rider scrambled to press his face to the earth. "Rise," Malini said to both of them, and they did, though the rider kept his face lowered. "What news?" she asked Rao. "Ahiranya has new rulers," said Rao. "The region is dead." Lady Bhumika? She thought. Priya? She hoped. "Tell me what happened," she said. The man looked too awestruck to talk, so Rao said gently and firmly, "Tell the Empress." "Priests," he told her, now ruled in Ahiranya. "No, not priests. Temple elders. like the days of old, or people who claimed to be temple elders. 2 women were among them. Some say the High Elder was once the regent's wife, the writer said. Who told you so? Rao asked. People talk, he replied. Merchants and people in the city, people on the road. You did not see them directly. No, he hesitated. But go on, said Rao. Everyone knew, he said, that the temple elders were truly what they claimed to be, because since their rise to power, the forest around Ahiranya had grown stranger than it ever had been. He'd heard tales of the trees turning and twisting as if they were alive, watching people pass them by. Emperor Chandra had apparently sent a small group of scouts, then another, to test Ahiranya's borders. A fruit seller who regularly traveled in and out of Ahiranya had found 12 imperial soldiers dead, speared on thorns as thick as a man's arm. The rest were simply never found. The writer himself had never seen any violence, only Ahiranyi living in their lives as they had normally did. The merchants he'd seen, a reluctant handful at most, who went out of desperation and necessity rather than desire, had traveled through Ahiranya unharmed, and the writer had gone unharmed himself, of course. But he had seen new soldiers on the streets, not the regent's men in parijati white and gold, but groups of men and women in plain mismatched armor, carrying sickles and bows instead of traditional parijati sabers. Malini could feel Rao watching her. He knew something of her relationship to Ahiranya, if not everything. No one, not even Rao, was owed everything. But he knew she had been saved by the Ahiranyi, knew she had a bond with them. Thank you, she said to the writer. Go with Yogesh and you'll be rewarded. Coin and a warm bed to sleep in, and food, and she would make sure he was watched, to see if his information was handed to anyone else. When she returned to her tent, she called Lata to her side. I'll need you to scribe for me, she said. As Lata sought out ink and paper and lit a candle, Malini began to search for the right words, the politically expedient words, something to affirm her support for Ahiranya, something that would tell Lady Bhumika and Priya, and anyone that had allied with them, that she had not forgotten what she had promised them, once she had her throne. The best emphasis she could give her words, of course, was action. Once this letter was done, she would send others to her allies in Shrugna and the estates that bordered Ahiranya, encouraging them to maintain strong trade ties with the new temple elders. The forest might have grown stranger even than when she had known it, but the writer had made no suggestion that it was dangerous to anyone but Chandra's men. Surely, then, the forest and all its strength lay in Lady Bhumika's control, and Priya's. And Priya, at least, she trusted. She could not entirely help herself. She wanted to tell Priya that she had not forgotten her, but forgetting or not forgetting Priya was not a political concern. It was a thing of her heart, the husk of a flower she wore on a chain around the throat. It was the memory, preserved in green and shining in her hand, of the 2 of them lying by a waterfall, gazing at one another, water glinting on Priya's dark hair, her smiling mouth. She should have banished the thought, but she did not. Instead, she decided she would ask Rao for his writer again. She would send a discreet message. One of the elders of Ahiranya, and one not. She told Lata what to write, and Lata did so. This letter, exquisitely formal and written in Lata's careful, elegant script, would pass under the eyes of a military administrator and the lords who served her. But the letter for Priya would not, and she wanted to write it with her own hand. I can write this message for you too, milady, Lata said, when Malini took up the ink and paper. This one will not be seen by the lords tomorrow, Malini said. Lata was silent, but her silence was pointed. It made Malini laugh faintly. She raised her head. I know there are no true secrets, she said, but there will be nothing to trouble them in this. Should I fall into their hands, and even an empress may send a kindly letter now and again to an old ally. If anything, Lata's face grew graver. She had spent a great deal of time with Malini on this journey. She knew more of Malini's heart than anyone, though Malini had not spoken of it. There is a saying among the craftsmen and women of Parijat, who turn bronze and gold and stone into effigies of the mothers, Lata said. They say, when a statue is first wrought, it shines so brightly, any man may look upon it and see a mother divine, but all things tarnish when the rain falls upon them. Poetic, Malini murmured. Empress, Lata said in a quieter voice. You have a golden tail surrounding you. Do not allow it to weather so soon. Malini thought again of the men kneeling before her, the sun beating overhead, their voices chanting Empress Malini, Mother Malini. It will tarnish one way or another, said Malini, and I need to start telling new stories to replace it. Make sure the letter is given to Rao's rider when I am done, and give him coin enough to encourage his discretion. Lata argued no more. Malini should not write it, she knew, but she wanted to. I looked upon the ocean, she wrote, and it made me recall a tale of a river, and of a fish, searching for a new world on its bank. And I remembered a tale of garlands, and ill stars, and two people who found their way to one another. Tell me, do you remember it too?